Tally-ho, pip-pip and zing-zang spillip. You're listening to Kaikki uusiksi, the podcast in which we attempt to make sense of society, the economy, work, the climate, culture, politics, and other aspects of human life. My name is Toivo Haimi. Dear listener, as you may have deduced, this week's episode will be in English. We have with us Dr. Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek superstar economist, author of best-selling books The Global Mind Tour and Adults in the Room. Dr. Varoufakis served a brief stint as finance minister in Alexis Tsipras' cabinet in 2015. Currently, he's a member of the Hellenic Parliament, representing his newfound left-wing movement, Mera 25. We'll be talking with Dr. Varoufakis about the evolution of capitalism into techno-feudalism. Also, we'll be talking about the overarching power of central banks in our economy, the possibility of democratic reform inside the EU and its institutions, and of course, how we should, as societies, tackle global inequality and wealth disparity. Welcome to the show, Dr. Yanis Varoufakis.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Varoufakis, you claim that capitalism is in the process of replacing itself with something called neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism. Now, techno-feudalism sounds like an awful lot of fun to me. When I imagine it, it sounds like having a rave party in a medieval setting in some castle in Central Europe. But the truth is, however, much more grim. You have asserted that this new economic order is actually far worse than capitalism. Please explain what you mean by techno-feudalism.
Let's begin with capitalism, shall we? Because many of my friends and comrades on the left disagree with me, saying, come on, Yanis, what's going on is capitalism has shifted the gear. We're now in hyper-capitalism, rentier capitalism, another version of monopoly capitalism. And, these are all claims that I need to take very seriously. The reason why I'm saying that capitalism is no longer a good word by which to describe the system we live in is because capitalism, even though it has undergone many different metamorphoses, very radical metamorphoses, the capitalism of the 19th century has nothing to do with the capitalism of the 1920s. And the capitalism of the 1950s and 60s has nothing to do with the capitalism of the 2000s and 2010s. And today we have new transformations. Nevertheless, all the capitalisms that we've had from the very inception of capitalism, from the 18th century onwards, they shared two fundamental qualities, two fundamental elements, pillars. One was that the number one motive, the fuel of the system, was profit. That was not the case under feudalism. It was not the case under the Roman Empire. This became uniquely associated with capitalism in ways that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels described so well. The second pillar of capitalism is that almost everything happens through markets. So whereas under feudalism, you had most of economic activity taking place outside of markets. So peasants worked the land, they didn't work for a wage, there was no labor market, they couldn't get hired or fired. There was no market really for land. Either you inherited land or you conquered it or you didn't have it and never would get it. So most activity, there were markets always, but they were peripheral to the bulk of economic activity. But under capitalism, everything happens through markets. The labor process, even surrogate motherhood, DNA is being marketed, even asteroids are being exploited, or there are plans to exploit them via markets. Okay, so profits and markets. These are the two things that are essential to capitalism. Now, since 2008, I've been observing that both these pillars have been replaced without us realizing. The main driver today of Western capitalism, in particular, is not profitability. The great corporations that are doing magnificently well don't have any profits. If you look at Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, Spotify, from your neck of the woods up in Scandinavia, even Amazon, There are very little profits. What drives the system since 2008 is money printed by the central bank. That has never happened before. If you want to look at what drives capital flows, financial capital accumulation, you have to look at what central banks do. That's not a capitalist trait. Secondly, markets. I mentioned Amazon. I didn't mention Google, but I should mention Google. The moment you enter Amazon.com, you are no longer in a marketplace. You are in a very strange digital environment where there are many buyers and sellers, but what is sold, how it is sold, what is bought, what you as a consumer can see once you get into Amazon.com, all that is determined by one algorithm that belongs to one man, Jeff Bezos. It is as if you were to walk outside the building which you find yourself now in, and you were to look around and to realize, this is a parable, that every street, every building belongs to one person. Everything that is traded in your town goes through that one person. Everything you can see in that town, as you're walking, there's an invisible hand turning your head and shutting your eyes to some things and opening your eyes to other things, is determined by the algorithm of one person. That's not a digital market. This is a digital fiefdom that resembles feudalism. Because back in feudalism, the whole village that fell within the estate of the Lord belonged to the Lord. So it's a digital kind of feudalism, a techno-feudalism, that is also driven by state money. That's very much like what feudalism was all about. The money was printed by or minted by the king. The power was not within the king, mostly it was within the techno-lords. Okay? The fundamental difference now is that this whole thing is not the difference with feudalism that techno-feudalism has, is that feudalism was based on land. Rents were extracted from land. Land ownership made the lords powerful and allowed them to expropriate the produce of the peasants. Today, it's not land, and it's not capital as we know it. It's a new form of algorithmic capital. So Uber doesn't need to have capital, physical capital. It doesn't need to have taxes. It doesn't have to hire labor. Airbnb doesn't need houses. It uses your house. So you've got a precariat on the one hand, working in Amazon warehouses. You have a salariat, people relying on a salary, working for the large corporations, financial companies, and so on. Then you have what I call vassal capitalists, people who are still capitalists, but do not have the real power that they used to. And now they are vassals of the class of people who own the algorithms. I call this algorithmic capital because it is capital. I call it cloud capital because it lives in the cloud. And those, you might as well call them cloudalists if you want, or cloud capitalists, right? This cloud capital is everywhere. So unlike feudalism, techno-feudalism is the triumph of capital, of what I call cloud capital, algorithmic capital. But the system is not capitalism anymore. It is something worse.
All right. That sounds interesting, but also very, very horrifying. So if I understand you correctly, techno-feudalism has transformed the role of the markets into platforms, and these platforms into personal fiefdoms of a handful of billionaires who control their platforms as absolute overlords. That sounds great for the Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, and the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world, but what about the rest of us? What is the role of the citizen?
We're stuffed. We're completely and utterly stuffed because for two reasons. Firstly, hugely concentrated power became even more concentrated. And that, of course, means the end of any notion of democracy or social democracy. But it also means something else. It means stagnation. Because this huge concentration of power results in the huge concentration of wealth. and huge concentration.
And vice versa, I think.
Yeah, and huge inequality. And from a Keynesian perspective, a massive macroeconomic crisis, because let's face it, most of us are working for these feudalists, those techno-feudal lords, even when you post something on TikTok, when you are carrying your phone around, Google Maps knows where you are, and that builds up the capital of Google. You're not getting any of it. All this you see, this is another difference between techno-feudalism and capitalism. Under capitalism, the only way somebody could accumulate capital was to employ you, extract your surplus labor, and part of that surplus labor to turn it into capital accumulation. But now we are all producing for free. We are unwaged labor for that techno-feudal class, and the result is that we don't have spending power, because we are producing capital for the very, very few, but without any spending power of our own. So that creates a macro dynamic of stagnation and crisis. And that crisis cannot be ameliorated by a political system, because the political system, caught up between the immense power of the financial sector and of those who own cloud capital, our politicians are either inept or completely in their pockets. They are either powerless or, are on the payroll of techno-feudal lords. So this system, where capital has become so triumphant that it killed off capitalism as well, is prone to greater crisis.
Yes, that sounds even more pessimistic. That not only there's the redistribution of wealth and let's not say the means of production, but the very commodification of human experience. Because as far as I can tell, that techno-feudalism sounds inescapable. Because in capitalism, like you said, one is a worker during work hours, but the rest of the time you are free. You can rest, you can read books, you can spend time with your family and whatnot. But in techno-feudalism, you are constantly living inside a digital fiefdom, like a medieval peasant would be living in an actual fiefdom.
You are right, and your generation, younger people than me, you have to reckon with that, because you see, I'm a Marxist, I'm a left-winger, I was never very keen on liberalism, but there were some good things about liberalism. The idea of the autonomous liberal individual, which of course was always a fiction under capitalism, but nevertheless was a good fiction to have. Now that has gone, because let's face it, young people, I'm now speaking not as a politician, but as until recently, professor in a university. What I see around me is young people who are struggling to market themselves. I see people who are investing in their social media profile in the hope that when they apply for a job, the employer is going to look at their Twitter account, their TikTok account, their Facebook, and see someone in there that they want to employ, not who this person is. So this person, in their spare time, young people are trying to create a persona which is not them, but which they will be able to sell. Now that, this is dystopic science fiction in practice, in action.
Yes. Please forgive me for my vulgar Marxist rhetoric, but history, as I see it, has been a series of class struggles. First there were slaves versus patricians, then the feudal peasants versus the feudal lords, and then, as we know, the industrial working class versus the bourgeoisie. But when we think about techno-feudalism through this lens of class dichotomy, you already talked about the salaried class, the precariat, and the techno-overlords, but is there a class dichotomy, a class struggle within the order of techno-feudalism?
There is definitely a class struggle, since we are, if anything, regressing. We're not moving towards a classless society, we are moving to a society where the class war is intensified. But what I think is this, look, Marx was prognosticating the polarization of the class war, that, under feudalism you had 10 classes, And then as capitalism was taking over, some of those classes were dying. And then eventually there was a great polarization between two classes that would come to the final clash, the proletariat and the capitalists. Now that happened more or less. But the combination of the New Deal, the mid-war period with fascism, and the war, and the post-war Bretton Woods system, created a third class again. It emerged as a middle class in between with a mixed economy. I think that it was also a very clear repercussion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, because I'm a dialectician like I suspect you are, I believe in the dialectical evolution of history. So the emergence of the Soviet Union freaked out Western capitalism. They were very worried, especially after 1945, when Britain voted Winston Churchill out. The Communist Party of Italy had 35%. The Communist Party of France had 30%. So it was inevitable that we would make concessions to the proletariat. They made the concessions, of the welfare state, public hospitals, public schools, public universities, social democracy. And of course, they started taking it all back once the Soviet Union proved inept and collapsed. So what is now happening after 2008 and the remarkable manner in which governments and central banks banded together to print loads of money to save the financial sector from its own hubris, is that we have had a period of, as you put it, dichotomy. The middle class was disappearing, they're losing their homes and so on. So the polarization between the proletariat and the capitalist class was heightened for a while. But then with the immiseration, the conversion of the proletariat into precariat, going back to the 19th century, a class that now had no access to basic protections, casualized, and effectively non-existent in the eyes of the state. That's the precariat. So that divided the proletariat in two, the precariat and the proletariat. You have the salariat that is building up through, in particular, take the culture of startups. Yeah. Young people finishing university, good technicians, right? They work like hell in companies that don't pay them anything, but they give them shares or share options, hoping that Google will buy them out, and then suddenly they will be billionaires at the age of 31, and not having to work again. But that's a very significant mass of young, talented people, not just in Silicon Valley, but in Finland, everywhere. And now you have this split between the capitalist class is splitting between the vassal capitalists and the cloudalists, as I call them, the techno-feudal lords. So now this is consistent with I'm not saying that my theory is right. What I'm saying is that this part of my explanation is consistent with what I was saying before. If we are regressing to a kind of feudalism, very different to the original feudalism, then again, the class system is fanning out. We have more classes coming into it. So we had a period during which, yes, the number of classes was folding into two, as Marx was prognosticating, but now, with the return of a different kind of digital feudalism, we have more classes appearing, and that makes the class war less visible, and therefore more toxic.
When economic changes and shifts in power balances are concerned, there is always a redistribution of power. And I wonder, what does this economic shift from capitalism into techno-feudalism, what does it mean for the distribution of power in societies? And actually, my question is, how compatible is techno-feudalism at its, say, advanced stage with democracy and representative government in general?
Well, it's not.
That's clear.
It's not about that. I never believe that capitalism is consistent with democracy. The idea of liberal democracy is a joke. And the early liberals understood it. If you go back to the 19th century, people like John Stuart Mill were very adamant. He was liberal and he was not a Democrat. He was actually a nice person, John Stuart Mill. He was even a feminist. But he understood that, there is a big contradiction between the idea that you have a corporation where voting takes place on the basis of who can buy the more votes, because that's what shares are. They're votes. So if you've got a share market, right, and it's all driven by profit maximization and therefore share maximization into the profitable companies, right? So if you are Warren Buffett, what you want to do is you want to buy the most number of votes in the corporation that you're purchasing. So this is the opposite of democracy. It's like a democracy in which votes are for sale in an unequal society. In that case, the few, the oligarchs, are going to buy the votes. So John Stuart Mill understood it. He was consistent, the poor man. He said, we can have liberalism or we can have democracy. We cannot have both liberalism and democracy. Now, when you go from liberalism to feudalism, a technological version of feudalism, right, and you don't even have markets to keep the bastards honest, because there's no competition. If you and I produce, let's say, software far better than Facebook's, who cares? All your friends are in Facebook, so nobody's going to come to our Facebook, even if it's better. So you've got a feudal system there under Facebook with WhatsApp and all that, and there's no competition there. So you don't have democracy and you don't have competition.
And the next part of my question is that what does this new economic order mean for the left, in the political left? And is the old, and I mean the old by 20th century Marxist industrial left, is it sufficiently equipped to fight against this new economic order? If politics, representative politics becomes impossible, what's the function of the left in this?
Well, the function of the left is to fight for the end of exploitation. So we have never been more necessary, we of the left, than now. And we have never been more useless than now. Never been so necessary, never been so useless. Let's be honest with one another, right? And we're useless because we are stuck within a social democratic tradition where the left is the official left, the parties of the left that are somewhere near government, even if near opposition, let's say, being the official opposition, they're the ones that emanate from the trades unions that have, a glorious history, but no future. And they have no future because they cannot tackle the Amazons of the world. They can play a role in tackling the Amazons of the world, but they cannot tackle them on their own. And to be clear on this, as I said before, remember, exploitation used to take place inside the labor market, confined to the labor market. If you wanted to accumulate capital, you had to do it by employing someone and paying them a wage. Now you do it without paying them a wage. You do it through the techno-feudal order. So exploitation is out there. Old-fashioned capitalist exploitation is only a small percentage. So that doesn't mean that trade unions are not necessary. They are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Trade unions are necessary, but they're not sufficient. So what we are trying to do with the Progressive International, with DiEM25 that I'm involved with Mera 25 here in Greece, we are trying to devise ways in which, by which to bring together traditional trade union activities like strikes with consumer boycotts. And boycotts by the producers of what I call cloud capital. So let me give you an example. If we want to bring down Amazon, we cannot do it simply through what Chris Smalls did, which is fantastic, and I applaud him. He's my hero for organizing a trades union in New York City at JFK. It's important, but it's not enough. What I would want to envision is a situation where we have a global day of action during which trade unions strike and we inspire the people of the world not to visit Amazon.com for that day, because that would bring down its share price. And that would really keep Jeff Bezos awake at night. The odd strike in the odd Amazon warehouse will not do it. So I need to combine financial engineering, by which to attack the derivatives containing the debt of the hedge funds and of the public utilities that were privatized. We need to have days of not visiting particular websites and trades union activity. That kind of left-wing action would work, can work, is the future, but it cannot be nationally based. It has to be transnational.
Just like the corporations.
Internationalism and transnationalism was never more necessary.
I agree. As we talked about earlier, in my view, the main object of left-wing politics is tackling the looming climate crisis, the global crisis of inequality and wealth disparity. However, the question is, are our institutions fit for broad redistribution of wealth and power? And by institutions, I mean parliaments, governments, central banks, nation states, and international organizations such as the EU. What's your view on this?
No. Or actually, if they are helping the redistribution of power from the have-nots to the haves. And we can take them one at a time. I already mentioned central banks. Central banks are empowering the financiers who are empowering the techno-feudal lords. It really doesn't have to be that way. Imagine if a central bank were to give everybody a digital wallet, a central bank digital currency, and instead of printing money to giving to the commercial banks to give it to the techno-feudal lords, imagine if there was a basic income that was that took the form of credits into the digital wallet of every citizen. So central banks could play a very progressive role if we made it do it. But at the moment, the only people that the central bank is answerable to are the commercial banks and the techno-feudal lords. That requires a political revolution to change, but it can be changed. If you look at parliaments, well, national parliaments are the last people to know what's going on or to make any decisions that affect anything of significance. Because let's face it, especially the European Union, especially in the Eurozone, we have rendered our parliaments completely neutered and inept and impotent, I should say, not inept, impotent. Because the moment you take away monetary policy from a state, and the moment you therefore create fiscal constraints that give no degrees of freedom to anybody who's elected, essentially you throw into the mix tax competition.
The race to the bottom.
The race to the bottom. Then suddenly, your government in Finland, our government here in Greece, even the French government, even the German government, in the end, become glorified municipalities. They can look after the garbage collection and paint the pavements and make sure that the trains run on time, and they can be judged on that. But they are not anymore capable of doing that which Roosevelt did in 1933, when he shut down the banks and said, on your bike, and I'm going to redistribute income towards the poor. Now that no government can do that anymore. So, but that's not an accident. It was a part of a very long process of designing the Eurozone, designing the European Union in such a way as to ensure that no government, even if they wanted to, could redistribute power, wealth, income from the haves to the have-nots. And the result, of course, is that we have impotent states that cannot really deal with climate change now, and the salvation of the species. These institutions need to be taken over, and they can only be taken over through this kind of holistic transnational class struggle, which involves financial engineering. I'll say it again. It involves consumer boycotts, citizen boycotts, and trades unions activities.
And also electoral politics, because as we mentioned earlier, you, Dr. Varoufakis, you served as finance minister in 2015 in the middle of the Greek sovereign debt crisis, and following the failed negotiations with the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Commission, you resigned from government in September 2015. But you have, however, returned to electoral politics, and since 2019, you have represented the left-wing movement Mera 25 in the Hellenic Parliament. What made you come back and believe in electoral politics after 4 years out of it?
I never stopped believing in electoral politics. Just that I was part of a government whose main party, Syriza, my colleagues and friends and comrades back then, surrendered. They surrendered to the most hideous Austerian creditors in the history of the world. So I was not going to legitimize them by staying there. And so I then got involved in what I always thought was important, to create a transnational movement. That was DiEM25. And DiEM25 then proceeded to create parties in various European countries, small parties, because, we have no money. And we were not part of the traditional left, because the traditional left, the European Party of the Left, I'm afraid, is obsolete. It's obsolete because it's nation-based. And it's a loose confederacy of parties that don't agree with one another. They don't agree with each other. They don't agree within themselves. And therefore, the result is that they are putting forward in elections irrelevant manifestos. So we created something from scratch, and we entered parliament under our own transnational radical left, post-capitalist, socialist, call it what you might, manifesto.
All right. So there is still hope for both citizen activism and electoral politics. But the thing is, as I understand it, is to start a domino effect. First, national parliaments and cabinets and governments, then the European institutions such as the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and so forth and so forth. But as Europeans, my view is that we need to talk about the European Union as an institution and its lack of democratic accountability, such as the European Central Bank. As I see it, the European Central Bank is the Vatican of monetary policy. Its priests tell us the supernatural will of money itself. But the ECB is not accountable to any democratically elected institution, and I see this as a critical lack of accountability in our system. So my question is, do you see a possibility for democratic reform inside the European Union and its institutions through the institutions of the EU?
Well, let me start by making a comment about hope. As left-wingers, we have a moral duty never to lose hope. So there's always hope. I remember an old communist once said to me when I was very young, "My boy, you must never give up hope and you must always have an opinion." So I try to stay faithful to that old commie's instructions. Okay, let's talk about ECB. Look, the tragedy with the Eurozone is we created a central bank without a state to have its back, and 19 states without a central bank. And you only have to state that to realize that this is not just a violation of democratic principles, but it's also utterly irrational. And the result is stagnation, the Euro crisis, the continuation of the fragmentation of the European Union, the inflammation of racism, xenophobia, one part of Europe turning against the other part of Europe, every country turning against itself, the class war intensifying. The ECB has been, and the particular construction of the euro, is instrumental in all those developments. Now, if you're asking me, can the EU be reformed through its institutions, through clever ideas? No, it can't. Over the last 30 years, I've been putting forward ideas. I know that even when the powers that be are impressed, they are powerless to execute them and to implement them and to adopt them. However, this is not an argument for disbanding the EU. It's not an argument for Finexit, for Grexit, for Brexit, for Fraxit, for Italexit. It's an argument for us banding together transnationally within the EU to take over the institutions. The European Union If this was, 50 years ago, and I was being asked, do you support the creation of the EU? I would probably say no, because I could see that it was going to become a cartel of big business. But after 60, 70 years of this thing evolving, right, now we are so interconnected. We have awful institutions, but common institutions. And, ripping them apart, it's only going to benefit the ultra-right-wing xenophobes. We saw that in Brexit. There were, left-wing Brexiteers, friends of mine. I didn't agree with them. I campaigned against Brexit. But there were, very good friends of mine of the left who were Lexiteers. They had a left-wing argument in favor of Brexit. And I was saying to them that, look, if Brexit wins, you're not going to be the winners. It will be the right-wing xenophobes that benefit from Brexit. And I think that was completely confirmed by history.
I agree.
Similarly with Finland, Greece, and so on. So, no, we are not going to leave the EU. We're going to be the last ones to get out, but we're going to struggle together to take over the asylum. And it is an asylum.
I hope we will win in our triumph, because after all, one of the central tenets of left-wing beliefs of politics of the left is that struggles are common. They are not isolated, insular struggles within Finland or within Greece or the United Kingdom or Germany, but it is one common struggle. And if you're right, Dr. Varoufakis, it'll be a common struggle against our new techno-feudal overlords. But from the bottom of my heart, I really hope you're wrong on this one, because living under techno-feudalism would sounds really depressing and inescapable. So there must be a struggle against this new economic order. So on that note, with a bit of optimism, I think, thank you very much for this interview, Dr. Yanis Varoufakis.
Well, thank you very much. But let me just make one point.
Yeah.
That I don't know whether we're going to win. Most probably not. So what? It's going to be great fun trying together.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for listening to Kaikki uusiksi. Please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is brought to you by Kansan Uutiset, the best Finnish language left-wing magazine in existence. Please subscribe to it to support the show and pay my salary. Subscribe to KU at kansanuutiset.fi. If you found our discussion interesting, please share your thoughts with us. We can be found on Instagram at Kansan Uutiset. If you wish to, you can also send a postcard to Kansan Uutiset, Hämeentie 105A, 00550, Helsinki, Finland. Our guest today was Dr. Yanis Varoufakis. My name is Toivo Haimi. Have a nice Easter. Tally ho!